The year is 1969. Over 200 exploratory wells have been drilled in Norway's North Sea and still no oil. But this wasn't a surprise. A decade earlier, the Norwegian Geological Society had said it was highly unlikely that there was any oil or gas in the continental shelf, and American company Phillips Petroleum agreed. After years of failure, they were ready to go home. But as they packed their bags, the Norwegian government reminded them of their contractual obligation. They had to drill one more hole. Realizing it was cheaper to drill the hole than pay the fine, Phillips begrudgingly took one last shot. On October 25, 1969, with many of the crew members packed and ready to go, they drilled well block 241. Geologist Max Melley stared at the golden glow in the rock as it was cut under ultraviolet light, a telltale sign of oil. But he'd never seen something so bright before. He famously said, "I thought we had found a gold mine." And nearly 2 months later, on Christmas Eve, the Norwegian authorities confirmed to the world, "We have oil." This one decision would change the future of Norway forever. The country would go from the poorest Scandinavian nation to one of the richest countries on Earth. In fact, when looking at income per capita, Norway is the richest country, richer than Singapore, Qatar, and the United States of America. This is the Norway, too rich for their own good. During the Viking Age, Norway was recognized as the poorest of the Scandinavian kingdoms, and up until the mid-19th century, their economy was predominantly based on agriculture, timber, fishing, and later, shipping. Even after industrializing, Norway remained the poorest Scandinavian country, and in 1969, they had a GDP per capita less than both Denmark and Sweden. But fast forward to the year 2024, and the situation is remarkably different. Norway leads the pack. So what happened in those 50-odd years? Oil. In 1959, the Netherlands uncovered a gas deposit, but not just any gas deposit, one of the biggest in the world. This got the nearby United Kingdom all excited. Having slowly come off its colonial food stamps, the UK was hungry. They started proactively working towards defining boundaries with their neighbors so they could get some of that liquid gold. Norway, on the other hand, wasn't even sure there was much oil. As mentioned, the GSW declared there probably wasn't any oil. Luckily, convinced by the proactive British, in 1965, Denmark, the UK, and Norway reached an agreement delineating the continental shelf boundaries based on the median line principle, drawing lines equidistant from each other's coasts. The UK was ecstatic, and they were ready to get drilling. And Norway, unknowingly and luckily, signed the most important agreement in its long history. But there was just one problem. Norway didn't know how to drill for oil. In fact, Norway had very little capability when it came to almost any resource extraction. So they did what they had done with hydro decades prior. They relied on foreign companies. But before doing so, they set up a framework that ensured Norway would benefit from and control the resources. Companies would have the chance to extract and profit, but the state would ultimately own the resource and receive benefits through royalties and taxes. But again, up to this point, oil had yet to be discovered, and there were some close calls. For example, in 1967, Esso discovered the Balder oil field, which had an estimated 400 million barrels of oil. The only issue? They didn't have the technology to get it out. On to the next. More foreign companies explored Norway, and they kept coming up short. But in 1969, everything changed. US oil company Phillips discovered the Ekofisk field. But unlike Balder, Ekofisk was exploitable and much, much bigger. In fact, it was the largest oil discovery in the North Sea, something the Norwegians couldn't have dreamed of. With an estimated 3.3 billion barrels of oil, Norway had struck gold. And that agreement with the UK and Denmark, it came in super handy. Because if you look at this map, Ekofisk is nearly equidistant from Norway, the UK, and Denmark. Lady Luck was on Norway's side. And this luck continued for years. Next, they discovered Stafford, adding another 2.6 billion barrels. Then Gullfaks with 2.1 billion barrels, Ulsberg 1.2 billion, and then in 1979 came Troll. Although it had a lot of oil, it had much more gas. In fact, to this day, it contributes to 40% of all Norwegian gas, and is one of the largest gas fields in the entire world. All in all, Norway had over 5 billion barrels of oil and 65 billion cubic feet of gas. But this isn't the best way to look at the data. So take a look at this chart. It shows oil exports and gas exports by country in 2022. As you can see, Norway is 8th for oil and 4th for gas. Great, but definitely not the best. But what if you look at it on a per capita basis? Because may we remind you, Norway is a tiny country. Now, you can see that Norway has the second most exports of oil per capita and the second most exports of gas per capita. This equates to over $20,000 per person in exports per year. Moreover, of the top 10 gas exporters per capita, only 4 have strong democratic regimes, and of the top 10 oil exporters, only 2. So Norway is not only lucky to have incredible fossil fuel resources, but it happens to be one of the few countries to come across such bounties that have democratic institutions and low levels of corruption. The result? Everyone benefits from oil and gas. It is no wonder then that Norway has such a high standard of living. But what should they do with all that money? Real quick, over 96% of you aren't subscribed, so if you've been watching for a while, join the 4%. It's free and helps the channel. Now back to the video. Over time, Norway shifted more of their oil and gas industry to be state-controlled. Today, the state-run oil company Statoil, now known as Equinor, is responsible for 70% of all Norwegian production. But not only does the state control much of the oil and receive dividends from it, they also tax the oil aggressively, to the tune of 72%. Yes, you heard right. So where does all of this money go? Tax revenues and dividends are pushed into the government pension fund known as the Oil Fund, which is managed by Norges Investment Management. The government is then able to withdraw from the oil fund to help fund the budget. To ensure that there is money for future generations, the government can only withdraw up to the expected real return of the fund, currently 3%, and cannot take from the principal amount. This is great because it ensures that money will be there for generations to come. Because of these tight controls, Norway's budget is 80% funded by non-oil revenues. More on this later, which further ensures long-term sustainability of the Norwegian welfare state. So you might be asking, how much money does this oil fund actually have? 1.96 trillion US dollars, or 356,000 per Norwegian citizen. The oil fund is by far the largest state-run investment fund on Earth, nearly double the size of Saudi Arabia's PIF, Kuwait's Investment Authority, and Abu Dhabi's Investment Authority. This means that as oil and gas reserves dwindle and become less valuable, Norwegians won't be left out to dry. At least that's the theory. Everyone the world over is aware that Norway has a strong social safety net. I mean, look at all these US politicians constantly talking about Norway. Norway spends 4 times the OECD average on disability and sickness benefits. Education at all levels is tax-financed and free. And not only that, Norway spends more than any other OECD country on education per student at $20,000 per year. No matter how you cut it, Norway is very generous. And none of this would be possible without oil. But there's a tiny little problem. Norway has done very little to diversify. In fact, in 2023, Norway offered up 92 new areas of exploration in the Arctic, an increase from 28 the year prior. And since 2001, Norway's oil and gas exports have increased from 414 billion krona to 574 billion krona. In a world that's becoming increasingly focused on sustainability, Norway does not seem to care. And today, oil and gas represents 61% of the total value of Norway's exports. Which might lead you to ask, what are the other exports? Fish at 9%, machinery at 3%, aluminum at 3%, and the list dwindles on. Norway has literally done nothing to build its economy outside of oil and gas. And this is kind of the message we want to convey. The Norway is not replicable. There are only a few countries on the planet who are as lucky as Norway. And the only reason they aren't as prosperous is because they aren't democracies. The Norway is literally being lucky and democratic. Oil isn't the first time either. As we alluded to earlier, Norway has vast hydro capacity. Nearly 95% of their electricity comes from hydro. And funny enough, they didn't develop that either. They relied on foreign companies. Economists will cite how Norway has a very high productivity. In fact, they are the most productive non-tax haven in the world. They are 36% more productive than the innovation center of Earth, the United States. Sounds impressive, right? Well, not exactly. Based on our math, we estimate that Norway's productivity without oil and gas is closer to $65 per hour worked. That's below the US and peers like the UK, Italy, Canada, and Slovenia, and even lower than their Scandinavian counterparts. But even that isn't fair, because don't forget, Norway has unlimited cheap energy, which makes you wonder, if they have so much cheap hydro energy, why aren't they an industrial hub? Simple, they got complacent. According to the OECD, Norwegians work less than all other OECD countries, except one. While company creation and VC are booming the world over, Norway saw the lowest number of new startups since 2007, which was at the beginning of the Great Financial Crisis. Not only that, they have less venture investments than Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. What makes this stat even sadder is the fact that Norway has the largest state investment fund in the world. Even outside of startups, Norway isn't investing in research and innovation. Only 1.56% of GDP is spent on R&D. Compare that to Sweden at 3.4%, Finland at 2.96%, and Denmark at 2.89%. And these poor stats on innovation and company creation likely won't change. Remember how Norway spends more on education than any other country? Well, it doesn't seem to be working. Norway is below the OECD average on math and science, and average at reading. This all while spending nearly double the OECD average per student. Now you might be saying, who cares? They have all of this oil money. And yeah, you're partially right. But as the world increasingly moves away from oil and gas, their economy will experience headwinds. And although 80% of their budget is derived from non-oil revenue, you gotta remember that nearly 10% of all private employment is in oil and gas. The taxes these people pay aren't categorized as oil and gas revenue. When they spend on groceries, cars, and more, it doesn't count as oil and gas revenue. And let's not forget, these are some of the highest paid people in Norway. The reality is that much more of Norway's budget is heavily reliant on oil and gas than they care to admit. In fact, we're surprised they haven't done a risk assessment on this matter, which kind of shows how complacent they are. And while the state has been thoughtful about managing their fund, they have been reckless in industrial policy. Their failed policy can be summed up with one stat alone. The average age of the 10 largest Norwegian companies is 170 years. Yeah, you heard right. Norway is on the cutting edge of doing nothing. This extends beyond heavy industry and extends to areas like housing. Norway's housing starts have declined every year since 2016, while concurrently, housing prices have increased 56%. And unlike other global cities with housing inflation, international money is not the driver. In fact, Norway's population over the last 10 years has grown at a measly 6%, while countries like Australia and Canada have grown at double the rate. There's a lot of research that speculates why Norway is having a major housing crisis, but we think we know the answer. Taxes. Norway has an extremely high VAT or sales tax, very high income taxes, very high taxes on corporate sales, very high taxes on corporate income, very high taxes on pretty much everything except one thing, the sale of a primary residence. So quick question, if the government taxes everything extremely high and there is no industry to invest in, but there are no capital gains taxes on the sale of primary residences, where do you think people will invest their money? Bingo, housing. And if this continues long enough and people aren't building very many houses, what happens to the price of those homes? Well, they go up. And as you can imagine, what happens to household debt? It climbs to over 200% of income, the highest in the world. Norway doesn't seem to care, because at the moment they have an infinite money glitch. But as the economy eventually slows down and Norway realizes they have to do something, what then? Funny enough though, Norway thought they had an exit plan, and it wasn't working hard or being productive. It was actually digging even more earth and selling more resources, because now Norway discovered that they might be sitting on the largest phosphate reserve on planet Earth. Yeah, when you thought this country couldn't get luckier. 70 billion tons worth, almost 50% more than the next largest country. And apparently, this deposit could be worth more than 12 trillion US dollars. And just like with oil, geologists didn't expect it. And just like with oil, the timing couldn't be better. Phosphate is a key material in EV batteries, solar panels, and fertilizers. But unfortunately, in this case, only about 2 billion tons is mineable. taking the value from $12 trillion to $350 billion. And even if they develop the technology to extract more, this time around, many Norwegians are actually against it. Maybe the guilt of getting rich on oil has started to get to them. Furthermore, the Socialist Party SV successfully halted the process of issuing mining permits in 2025 in exchange for supporting the government budget. So, unlike with oil, this won't be a unanimous decision. This will be difficult, and maybe Norway will have to start working again. People the world over point to Norway as the economic model to replicate, but that would be like telling your 5'5" cousin he should be more like LeBron James in the paint. The fact of the matter is, you have to make do with what you got, and Norway got it all. They have abundant fish reserves to feed their people for generations. They have a river system that allows them to produce almost all of their electricity from cheap and clean hydro. They have oil and gas reserves unmatched by nearly every country on Earth. And to add insult to injury, they discovered that they happen to have the largest phosphate reserve in the world. But outside these strokes of luck, Norway is playing a dangerous game. Instead of leveraging their incredible resources for building industries, they've set up a fund and kicked back. Their students, they're getting dumber. Their workforce, they're getting lazier. And their industry is becoming more and more complacent. And as oil becomes less important globally, some forward-looking Norwegians are starting to wonder what their future might look like if things don't change. But until then, while the rest of the world stumbles through austerity and inflation, Norway drives to the hoop with no regard for human life, still cashing checks from a game everyone else stopped playing. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to 2 and 20 for more on economics and politics.